You're back for the continuation of your second week of English lockdown lessons. I must confess that I'm finding this tough, and I'm sure that you are too. You're always welcome to contact me via Edmodo, WhatsApp, Zoom, or email. Today we'll study the porter scene. It's funny, it's lewd, and it's a great way to relieve some of the dramatic tension. By now, you know what you need. Make sure you have everything ready. Today, 23 April, we're going to recap the murder scene before we move on to the porter scene. Those 5 themes aren't going anywhere. Continue to look for references to them. I'm sure you remember most of the plot of the murder scene. It starts with Lady Macbeth very much in charge, efficiently putting together the plan to assassinate the King of Scotland. Once Macbeth has killed Duncan, he seems overwhelmed by the enormity of his actions. An irritated Lady Macbeth has to tie up the loose ends, making herself just as guilty as Macbeth. The image of the blood on their hands is a powerful one. The sound of someone knocking on the castle door adds even more tension to the end of this scene. I asked you to consider 4 points at the end of the murder scene. Who do you blame for Duncan's death? It's not a simple answer. You have to consider the outside influences on Macbeth, the witches, his wife. In the end, we know that Macbeth will have to pay for what he has done in order to re-establish the balance in the world, as you know from our lessons on the chain of being. Shakespeare's tragedies generally end this way, a life for a life. Why doesn't Duncan get killed on stage? You know a little about the social conventions of Shakespeare's time. People believe that God appointed kings. To kill a king would be to deliberately defy or challenge God, an unthinkable action. Is Lady Macbeth starting to crumble? I don't think so. She takes charge of her husband in this scene, keeping her head when it appears he is about to lose his. She is certainly the more decisive of the two after the murder. Does Macbeth regret killing Duncan? Well, it certainly seems as though he wishes he could undo his actions. His speech patterns are disrupted, and his last line in the scene expresses regret. "Oh, I wish you could wake Duncan with your knocking," Macbeth says, to the sound of someone knocking on the castle door. The porter scene can be found on pages 62 to 73 in your textbook. A porter is a gatekeeper, a servant who must open the door and welcome guests to his master's castle. Macbeth's porter is a little worse for wear. In fact, he's got a huge hangover after drinking far too much while his master entertained Duncan at the banquet. He is in no hurry to answer the knocking and talks to himself as he stumbles to the door. In the next slide, you will watch a conversation between the Shakespearean porter and a modern television interviewer. The interviewer tries to figure out what the porter meant in his rambling speech.
Can't we just wait a bit? I think I'll wake up pretty quick here. Okay, just seems a little rude. Excuse me, sir. Sir. Welcome back, everybody. Today we're joined by the porter at the Macbeth Castle. We've just learned that Duncan has indeed been murdered by the Macbeths, and there's been a knocking at the gate which has caused the Macbeths to hurry back to their bedroom. It's the porter's job to answer the gate. That's what porters do. So we've invited him here to the studio to find out more about that. Excuse me, sir. It's very early in the morning, after all. Excuse me.
Eh, what's with the knocking?
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just trying to...
If a man were the doorman at the gates of hell, he'd be opening the door constantly.
Yes. Well, there are a lot of sinners in the world, aren't there? Oh dear, that wasn't much of an interview. Though, I suppose it's interesting that he would mention the gates of hell, just after the Macbeths have committed the worst crime imaginable, regicide, the killing of a king. Murder itself is pretty bad, of course, but in Shakespeare's day, the king was thought to have been appointed by God himself. For Macbeth to try to make himself king through murder would be a direct challenge to God's power. What's that? Oh, look, I'm happy to just wait it out. Oh, all right.
Knock, knock. Who's there in the name of Beelzebub?
Beelzebub? That's the name of one of the devils in hell, isn't it?
Oh. Well, look. Oh. Here's a farmer.
A farmer? It's not a sin to farm, is it?
Hung himself.
Oh, dear. Why?
He had a plan to get rich. Didn't work out.
Oh. Oh, that's right. Yes, I have a note about this. Let's see. Yes, there were cases of farmers who would spend all of their money buying up grain, hoping there'd be a famine. Wow, hoping there'd be a famine, so that they could resell all of the grain at a much higher price. It's not very nice.
Got the place nice and hot for you.
Are you talking to me? I'm not the farmer.
Hope you brought some handkerchiefs with you, because you're gonna be doing a lot of sweating.
But wait, so why did the farmer hang himself? Oh, I see. I guess it means the hoped-for famine never came, and he lost all of his money in the process of hoarding the grain. So is he in hell for hoarding the grain, or for the sin of killing himself? Well, I guess one sin led to the other. What's that? Okay, fine.
Knock, knock, knock. Who's there? In the other devil's name?
Other devil? Do you mean Satan?
Oh, hey, take it easy, buddy.
Or Lucifer?
I said knock it off!
Sorry. So maybe you're not supposed to say those names?
Well, looky here. Here's an equivocator.
Equivocator? Now, I know that word. Someone who equivocates. If I could toot my own horn for a bit. I scored an 800 on my SAT, and I happen to know the definition of equivocation. So it usually refers to multiple senses of the same word that are used to build to a misleading conclusion. I'll give an example.
Oh, fascinating.
A feather is light. What is light cannot be dark. Therefore, a feather cannot be dark. Get it? So light like the weight and light like the color. Can you go to hell for talking that way?
An equivocator can swear in both the scales against either scale.
Oh, I see. So you mean the scales of justice. So in this case, it's someone who doesn't really care about justice and can equivocate from either side of the scale to argue against the other side. That does sound pretty slimy.
No, who committed treason enough, for God's sake?
Oh, right. Sorry, I have notes about this too. You're referring to an actual case that Shakespeare's audience would have known about. So there was a Catholic priest who got involved with what's known as the gunpowder plot.
The one?
It was a plot to kill a Protestant king, which I suppose is what he meant by treason for God's sake. But so then he gets caught by the Protestants and he tries to equivocate his way out of the charges because he thinks it's okay for priests to equivocate.
He could not equivocate his way to heaven.
Well, yes, I suppose it would be hard to trick God with bad logic.
Well, please, come into hell, equivocator.
Who, me? Oh, no, the feather bit. That was just, that was an example. Isn't it interesting that he would use that example about someone trying to kill a king? And equivocation seems to be popping up a lot in this play, at least in the sense that you can't always tell what words mean. You remember Macbeth's reaction to the prophecy of the witches, for example. Could be good, could be ill. Macbeth seems to struggle with this kind of problem a lot. All right, already. Just making a little point. Thought that was my job.
Knock. Who's there? Oh, here's an English tailor.
A tailor? What's he doing in hell?
Oh, he's stealing out of a French hose.
Oh, right. I read about this one, too. I guess French tights were kind of baggy, so this tailor would steal some material from French hose to make some extras and therefore cheat his customers. Well, that's kind of interesting. It's kind of like equivocation again. His customers would think they were getting French hose, but they wouldn't really be.
Come in, tailor. Here you may roast your goose.
Roast your goose? What does that mean? Wait a second. I think a tailor's iron was called a goose. Is that what you mean? Like make your iron hot?
Yeah.
Well, so that's a clever thing to say. Clever because roast your goose then means at least two different things at the same time. You know, if you think about it, a lot of humor, puns for example, depend on this equivocation business, on certain words meaning more than one thing at the same time. So even equivocation itself can lead to laughing or go straight to hell. I guess it depends on what you're trying to do with it. I know. It's not my fault he keeps falling asleep.
Knock. Will this knocking never stop? And who are you?
Me. I'm not a visitor to hell. I'm just the interviewer.
Enough already. This place is too cold for hell. I'll devil porter it no further. I had hoped to let in all the professions.
Oh, you mean you think there are examples of wickedness in all the professions?
Of course! But at least the thieves and the murderers, they know where they're headed. Everyone else is on the primrose path to the everlasting bonfire.
Well, I guess that's the common thread with you, huh? People thinking that they've found a good way to do bad things. So they've made their path to hell look nice, but it's still leading to hell. You know, this guy doesn't even know what happened last night. But all of his examples of sinners remind me of the Macbeths in a way. They're all people that think they can take advantage of a situation without any cost to themselves. They all end up being wrong about that. And this raises an important question. Are the Macbeths so evil that we can't even relate to them? Or are they really just very dramatic examples of the kind of thing that everybody does all of the time? Okay, yes, you don't even have to ask.
Okay. What? Okay, come on. Do we have to keep doing this?
No, I mean, I thought it was just
somebody's knocking. Could we just let him in already?
Yes, of course. So that's what you do as porter. You open the gates.
Remember the porter.
Well, yes, of course. How could we forget you? But I think I see what you mean. You've actually taught us a lot about moral thinking with your little examples of visitors to hell. There's a lot we should consider seriously in what you've said.
Remember the porter.
Oh, you mean a tip. Or did you mean both? You're an equivocator. Okay, sure. Actually, you know what? Listen to this. If my pocket were to change, then it wouldn't be my pocket anymore. So there's no change in my pocket. Get it? Like pocket change? Okay, well, whatever. So, two Thanes, Macduff and Malcolm, have entered the gate, and Macduff wants to know if you went to bed really late. And that's maybe why it took you so long to answer the door. Porters are usually up very early.
I guess he got me there. We were partying until the second cock.
I'm sorry? Oh, you mean the rooster, the cockcrow. The second cockcrow is at dawn, I think.
Well, and drinking, you should tell this Thane guy this, is a great provoker of three things.
Well, now that the Thanes have arrived, I think we should just move on to what happens next. Thanks so much for...
Aren't you going to ask me what the three things are?
Well,
Drink is a great provoker. You love this. Of three things.
okay, so I happen to know where you're headed with this, and I just don't think it's a good idea here. I mean, children can...
Nose painting! Sorry.
Oh boy, here we go. Nose painting, you mean because it turns your nose red?
Sleep?
Yes. And I suppose that's why you mentioned it in the first place, to explain why you've slept so late. Oh, thank God.
Gotcha. And the third one. Oh, ow.
Maybe we could just leave it at 2 for this interview.
Nose painting, sleep, and urine. Urine.
Okay, that's very interesting. Thanks so much for joining us.
Now, lechery. Lechery is a slightly different category.
Oh, dear. I'm not going to define lechery, despite my SAT score. You can look it up.
When it comes to lechery, drinking provokes and unprovokes.
Both at the same time.
It provokes the desire, but it takes away the performance.
You know, actually, this reminds me of what we were talking about earlier. How can drink, which is one thing, do 2 different things at the same time?
Well, that's right. And you could say that too much drinking is an equivocator with lechery.
Exactly. Well, thank you once again.
It makes him and it mars him. It sets him on and it takes him off. It persuades him and disheartens him, makes him stand to and not stand to. In conclusion, equivocates him in a sleep and giving him the lie, leaves him.
Well, thanks for clearing that up. I think we all get the picture now. But actually, so one last question. Since Macduff can't seem to drop the subject, he wants to know if drinking did all of this to you last night.
Oh, well, he sure did. Why, he had me by the throat, but I fought back, and though he had my legs a bit wobbly, like a good wrestler, I threw him up. I might still have some on my chin.
Yes, that would explain the smell. Well, so it's at this point that Macbeth shows up to greet the visitors.
Oh. Better make myself scarce. He's not gonna like all this knocking.
Certainly.
You know how he is.
Yes.
Okay,
Thanks. Thanks for joining us.
Yes. This. Yeah. Okay. Ooh, he hit the. That's not the way.
It's just
This.
just right up. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Thanks so much. Yeah, just right.
I love you.
Thanks so much. Thanks again. Well, I don't know. If the porter had answered the gate on the first knock, this whole story might have turned out differently.
I hope you enjoyed watching The Drunken Porter as much as I did. In the next slide, we return to the classroom of British teacher Mark Birch as he explains this scene to us in more detail.
Hi, this is Mark Birch, and this is a quick revision of the opening of Macbeth Act 2, Scene 3, the Porter scene. This is the only moment of comedy in the play, and this kind of comic interlude follows the murder of Duncan. So you've gone from one of the most disturbing moments in the play to one of the lightest. And this is what I sometimes refer to as the kind of roller coaster of tragedy, that Shakespeare is trying to elevate the audience's emotions after having just dashed them. It's almost as if an audience can only experience so much horror, can only feel so profoundly. And once they've reached a really dark point, you can't take them much further down unless you lift them up again first. So rather like a roller coaster, we plummet down with the murder of Duncan and then are lifted up through the Porter scene so that we can again have our experiences dashed against the horror of the murder of Banquo, etc. The Porter states, "Oh, here's a knocking indeed." And that reference to knocking informs the audience that this scene follows the previous one directly in terms of temporal scales. The knocking that Macbeth wished would wake Duncan at the end of the previous scene is now being addressed by the porter. He's actually getting up and going to answer the door. And Shakespeare uses the semantic field of hell several times during the course of this, providing a kind of ironic link to the actions of Macbeth. The porter might be talking about hell in abstract terms here, but the audience can appreciate how it's absolutely appropriate to think of Dunsinane and Macbeth in hellish terms. The porter talks about being the porter of Hellgate, suggesting that if there was such a porter, they would never be idle because they'd constantly be answering the door, answering the gate, because so many souls need to enter hell. And again, that's entirely appropriate, entirely apt, given Macbeth's actions. Now, most of the rest of the porter's gags centre around kind of satirical jokes based around being the porter of Hellgate. He imagines the kind of people that would turn up to hell. And given that they're satirical jokes, they're not necessarily that funny to us today. So there's no need to kind of cling onto your sides to stop them splitting at this point. What is interesting, though, is the way in which they reveal something about the context of Jacobean England. The first person who he imagines turning up is a farmer. Here's a farmer that hanged himself on the expectation of plenty. And there was at the time an excess of produce. The harvests had been really good in 1605 to 1606. So what the porter's imagining is a farmer who had been incredibly greedy, who had withheld his crops in the hope that there would be an absence of produce, and then he would be able to sell it at a very high price. So the audience might appreciate that such a person who is being greedy might then suffer at their own hands in this way. Also, and this is particularly apt in terms of creating another layer of meaning that would be appreciated by some of Shakespeare's audience, the farmer was a pseudonym for one of the conspirators in the Gunpowder Plot against James I in 1605. So what we also have is an image that would appeal and an idea that would appeal to those who were in the know, those who would appreciate that kind of satirical level of humour, and those that were going on the more basic level of, oh, this is a greedy farmer who's getting his comeuppance. The second person that he imagines appearing at Hell's Gate is an equivocator. And this again could be a reference to the Gunpowder Plot. We have Henry Garnet, this Jesuit priest who was hung in 1606. The interesting thing about him is that he used equivocation during his trial to try and hide his involvement in that plot. When he did eventually confess, he claimed that his earlier perjury wasn't perjury, as he'd lied for God. Now, an equivocator is someone who uses ambiguous language to mislead, and so clearly Henry Garnet was being an equivocator, and also this is something that appears time and time again in the play, most notably with the witches, who use language in order to manipulate Macbeth. They tell him truths that lead him to his downfall. The final profession that the porter imagines meeting at Hellgate is a tailor. He says, "Faith, here's an English tailor, come hither for stealing out of a French hose." Now, on the surface, that's a joke about a dishonest tailor, someone who would be renowned for stealing fabric from their customers, but was found out because of the introduction of a new fashion, the tight-fitting French hose. There wouldn't be much fabric on this kind of garment, therefore stealing fabric from within it would mean that they would be found out, they would be discovered for their theft. However, it could also be another bawdy gag about tailors, who were stereotyped as womanizers, and those as a result would perhaps contract syphilis, which was known as the French disease. So again, you've got a joke, a topical joke, a satirical joke that's working on a couple of different levels. And finally, the porter steps away from satire to end with just straightforward bawdy comedy to lighten the mood. He discusses the three things that drink provokes, saying nose painting, in other words, getting a red nose from alcohol consumption, sleep, and urine. Then, once he's established that those are the three things that can happen when you've drunk too much, he talks about lechery, and what you get is an extended joke about erections. How alcohol can make a man lecherous, but also make him unable to perform sexually. It makes him and it mars him. It takes him off and sets him on. Shakespeare also extends that concept of equivocation here, the one that we saw earlier in terms of those that he's inviting into Hell's Gate, with alcohol now being the equivocator that can mislead a man's lecherous desires. So while, yes, this is just bawdy comedy on one level, and it'll certainly appeal to the audience, it could also bring in that theme again of the equivocator, though that idea of not being able to trust and being misled. Okay, so. Hi, this is Mark Birch with a quick revision of the second half of Act 2, Scene 3. Having welcomed the Scottish lords Macduff and Lennox into the castle, Lennox tells Macbeth about the strange occurrences of the night. The night's been unruly, chimneys blown down, strange screams of death, the earth was feverish and did shake. So you have this sense of a terrible change in nature, the whole of nature being disturbed, and that really reveals the kind of universal chaos that a Jacobean audience would expect to be brought about by an act of regicide. Regicide undermines the great chain of being. The hierarchy has been disturbed, and therefore universal chaos will be brought about, and that's what Lennox is describing. Having discovered Duncan's murdered body, Macduff cries out, "Most sacrilegious murder have broke ope the Lord's anointed temple," which is an extended metaphor relating to the king as the temple of God on earth. This is an allusion to the divine right of kings, the idea that the king is appointed by God. Therefore, to murder the king is to commit an act of sacrilege. Macduff is essentially reminding the audience of the unholiness of this act that's been committed by Macbeth. The murder's so horrific to Macduff that when he speaks about it, he says, "Approach the chamber and destroy your sight with a new Gorgon." Well, this is a reference to the Gorgons of Greek mythology, the most famous of which is Medusa. The effect, of course, of seeing a Gorgon is to be turned to stone, and the idea is that witnessing the murder of a king like this would be sufficient to petrify, in a literal sense, the person that sees it. It would turn them to stone, it's so horrific. After raising the alarm, Macduff shouts, "Shake off this downish sleep, death's counterfeit, and look on death itself." So once again we've got this motif of sleep, and the link between sleep and death is made apparent once again. It's also worth looking at the way in which sleep is described here. Not only death's counterfeit, a kind of copy of death in the sense that it's a loss of consciousness, but also downy sleep. Well, down is describing the kind of down, duck down, that you would put in pillows, so it's a reference to comfortable sleep, but it's a transferred epithet. It's the pillow that's downy, not sleep itself. So once again you get this sense of displacement, something being wrong, and there's something terribly wrong about sleep at this point when such horrific occurrences are taking place. We then witness some top dramatic irony when Lady Macbeth enters the scene and asks what's going on. Macduff refers to her as gentle lady. "'Tis not for you to hear what I can speak. The repetition in a woman's ear would murder as it fell." So Macduff's suggesting that the news of the king's death would be so terrible for a woman to hear that it would kill her. It would murder as it fell upon her. Of course, we know that Lady Macbeth's been instrumental in this death, so rather than kill her, she's the one that's been doing the killing, essentially. The response of Lady Macbeth and Banquo is really interesting. Lady Macbeth's "Woe, alas, what, in our house?" is potentially selfish because she's drawing attention to the setting. This happened in our house. The incredulity seems to be based around the fact that it could happen here, rather than the fact that the king's been murdered. And we know, of course, that Lady Macbeth is trying to put on a particular face to the world to look like the innocent flower, but she doesn't seem to have quite pulled it off here. And Banquo picks up on that. He seems to suggest that she's more concerned with where the murder took place, with her own selfish attitude, her own selfish reputation, than the fact that it took place. He says it's too cruel anywhere. It's the act that's terrible, not where it took place. Macbeth delivers a speech that's full of sadness and regret for the death of Duncan. But unlike Lady Macbeth, it is possible that Shakespeare's presenting genuine feelings of Macbeth, given the nature of the regrets that he showed at the end of Act 2, Scene 2. Of course, it is also possible he's acting just like Lady Macbeth and looking like the innocent flower, but being the serpent under it. The essence of what he's saying is that life's lost meaning with the death of Duncan. Duncan was so noble that life's now as empty as a plaything, a toy, as he puts it. Duncan was, metaphorically, the wine of life that's now been emptied from the vault, or cellar, of the earth, leaving only the dregs, what he describes as the lees, those who lack his qualities. In other words, everyone that's left on earth now is inferior. They are the dregs in comparison to Duncan. Even at this early stage of the play, Shakespeare presents Macduff in opposition to Macbeth. When Macbeth says that he killed the grooms, Macduff says, "Wherefore did you so? Why did you?" questioning Macbeth's motives. Macbeth blames his passion and impetuosity for the killing of the guards. He personifies his violent love as outrunning reason, the thing that would have allowed him to reflect on his actions and forced him to pause rather than just kill the guards. Macbeth seems to be trying to persuade the assembled nobles of the guilt of the guards. And one of the ways in which he does this is through the homophonic pun on breach. So, in one sense, breach, the first sense, is to create a gap, to create a hole. In this case, an enormous hole in the fabric of existence caused by the death of Duncan. He's been such a significant king that his loss has created this huge hole in the fabric of the universe. And then the second meaning of breach, spelt with a double E, is to be clothed, is to kind of wear trousers. And in this case, it's the daggers that are personified as being breached with gore. So by using essentially the same sounding word, breach and breach, Macbeth connects the murder of Duncan with the daggers of the guards, reinforcing the sense of their guilt. Lady Macbeth then pretends to faint. She's demonstrating that she's overcome by this terrible news, looking like the innocent flower. And Macduff calls on the assembled people to help her. Look to the lady. It's interesting that following asides by Malcolm and Donalbain, Banquo says, "Look to the lady," clearly echoing Macduff's earlier request to support Lady Macbeth. So dramatically, it's possible to have no one really responding to Macduff, and yet Banquo's identical command elicits an immediate response, showing the power of Banquo. And of course, this would appeal to James I because he traced his ancestry back to Banquo. Banquo also provides a powerful contrast to Macbeth. Here he's saying, "In the great hand of God I stand." He's standing for righteousness. And that's a direct contrast to Macbeth's inability to say Amen in Act 2, Scene 2, as a result of the regicide excluding him from communion with God. In contrast, Banquo is the representative of God in this regard. The scene ends with Malcolm and Donalbain contemplating what to do next. Donalbain says, "Where we are, there's daggers in men's smiles," with this metaphor conveying the idea that there are murderous thoughts from those who pretend to be friends. And of course, this idea of deceit, this theme of duplicity, is echoing Lady Macbeth's "look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under it." It's an idea that's been used time and time again within the context of the play. He also says, "The near in blood, the nearer bloody," a form of parallelism that reinforces the idea of the connection between danger and relatives. The near in blood are those who are of the same blood, in other words, relatives. And it could be that Macbeth is the nearest relative to Duncan's sons, and so the most likely, in their eyes, to have murderous intent, because he's most likely to be the person that we put forward to be on the throne next, as we see he indeed is. Okay, ta.
Although this scene is pretty funny, there is serious plot development taking place. These 4 quotes show how Macbeth's castle in Inverness is equated to hell, and how the death of Duncan both shocks and frightens the other characters. That brings us closer to the end of Act 2, which we'll finish in the next lesson. Until then, goodbye.